Thank you everybody for coming. I'm Erica Barton,
I'm Jose Rivas.
and we're going to be presenting today on linguistic privilege and monolingual ideology in the healthcare system. I'm just going to start by talking about how language shapes our world. Language provides a framework for how we take in information, how we process that information, and then how we express and communicate that information outward. So it essentially pervades every single interaction that we have with other people, with our environment, and so therefore with the world. So when we're conditioned under a social system that perpetuates a social order, which creates a dichotomy of privilege and oppression, our language use reflects that conditioning. So I want to start by deconstructing the term monolingual ideology. This is essentially a language ideology that sets up a dichotomous hierarchy and reinforces a societal system of oppression. So, for example, within that dichotomy, we have the term native or native speaker of English as the neutral or unmarked entity, and the non-native English speaker as the other or the marked entity linguistically. So this dichotomous hierarchy is similar to the racialized system in the United States, which establishes a racial dichotomy, setting up whiteness as a neutral or unmarked entity, as opposed to the other, which would be the marked entity. So this ideology sets up for the concept, this dichotomous concept of nativeness versus non-nativeness, compartmentalizing these concepts or these labels of individuals. And it identifies, or rather, this compartmentalization is projected onto and reinforces the system of oppression. So examples of other dichotomies within our system of social hierarchy are colonizer or colonized, American or immigrant/foreigner, accent versus no accent, or man versus woman. So linguistically, you can see within these dichotomies or binaries, one linguistic term as being the marked term and one as being the unmarked term. And the unmarked term is usually the label that belongs to the dominant group within the social system. So, for example, if we look at accent versus no accent, we'll see a connection between the unmarked category of having no accent as being American versus someone who has an accent being the marked individual or marked category as being foreign. And so we can see a lot of layers within that hierarchical system. So individuals who speak primary or preferred languages other than English are often racialized within this linguistic system and identified as outsiders or the other. In addition, this ideology, within this ideology, the concept of Americans as being the neutral entity also arises. Yeah, went to sleep? With the next slide. Okay, so moving on to the concept of linguistic privilege. Within the system of monolingual ideology, that system allows for the concept of linguistic privilege. And this is a concept of superiority assigned to native English speakers within the system. And this allows for the systemic oppression of any non-native English speaker or that marked category. So linguistic privilege, like I said earlier, that language and how we use it, how it reinforces our social systems, pervades every interpersonal interaction that we have. So linguistic privilege, therefore, reinforces the systems, pervades every interpersonal interaction that we will have, including interactions that take place in healthcare systems. So individuals can use language to reinforce their power within the social hierarchy and to emphasize their membership to the dominant social group. And the way we use language can also reflect the intersectionality of privilege and oppression within an interaction as well. And interpersonal interactions, an individual with privilege may seek to unmark themselves through language and also to mark the other or the other person in the interaction in order to establish a dynamic or position of power. So through linguistically marking the other in any interaction, an individual may resort to patterns such as condescension, coercion, right, as in I know best, or manipulation to gain power over the other in this context, power over the individual seeking services in the healthcare setting. So what we say, how we say it, how we receive information and respond to it can all reflect our place in that social system of hierarchy. English language proficiency is not the only factor influenced by language ideology, as I said earlier. Other factors can be culture, gender and sexuality, race, nationality, and that's not an exhaustive list. There's multiple additions that we could make to that list. Oh, thank you. And these things are all influenced by the way we use language, by the power dynamics that we reinforce with the way we use that language. So one example is the use and acknowledgement of multiple gender pronouns, including those outside of the existing gender binary model of he or him and she, her. So that can create a dialogue and an interaction that is either inclusive or exclusionary, or one that reestablishes the concept of self versus other. So why is this important in healthcare? So we have some stats up here. More than 60 million people in the United States have a primary or preferred language other than English, and approximately 9% of the US population self-reports an ability to speak English less than very well. So this is a large number of people potentially seeking healthcare services with limited English proficiency, or LEP. And so therefore, they could be exposed to poor quality of healthcare services, or difficulties in finding access to language assistance within the healthcare system. The number of individuals seeking healthcare that do not share a first or primary language with their healthcare provider is increasing. And this can lead to discrepancies and an increased risk for medical error for those individuals who may already be anxious in that interaction or also vulnerable in other ways. So under that monolingual framework, cross-lingual and cross-cultural discourse can reinforce power dynamics and influence the quality of interaction as well as the services for an individual within the healthcare system. So providers can use language to establish a dynamic of power over, like I said earlier, in their interactions with clients. So for example, one issue that might arise is within a dialogue between a healthcare provider who speaks English as a primary language and a client or a patient who also speaks English as a primary or first language. So minimal response or head nods, certain gestures might be taken as understanding of what that healthcare provider has said in terms of treatment protocols, diagnosis, et cetera. But in an interaction where the healthcare provider speaks English as a first language and the client speaks a language other than English as their primary or preferred language, those minimal responses might be misconstrued and instead could lead to miscommunication or lack of understanding. So now Jose is going to talk about access.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, well, you can hear me either way. So, I've been fighting a cold, so if I cough a little bit, it's okay. So how does this come in with the social justice, and how do we tie language? And we can see that it's a systematic oppression, anything that has to do with the healthcare that's funded by the federal government. So to kind of talk about this, we have to go back all the way back to 1964 with the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination from race, color, national origin, and I'd like to include that this includes immigration status, whether you're undocumented or documented, or language proficiency, or which you prefer to talk about or speak when you go see a doctor. And of course, like any federal government, this is a requirement that's mandated for all healthcare services that is receiving federal funding. So we'll go and we'll traject what happens after 1964. So in 1964, like I mentioned, the creation of Title VI within the Act created no discrimination. So you fast forward about 15 years to 1980, when the Department of Health and Human Services issued notices to develop regulations to improve LEP, which is limited English proficiency and communication nationwide. Then again, in 2000, President Clinton issued Executive Order 13166, which states that LEP individuals should have meaningful access to federally funded programs and activities. And again, this means all healthcare departments across the nation. And in that same year, in 2000, the Department of Health and Human Services also issued culturally and linguistic appropriate services in the health care. And what does this mean? Well, it's called CLAS, and the CLAS standards from the Department of Health and Human Services created provisions to educate the workforce in linguistically and appropriate acculturation across the workforce. This means that individuals who are in the healthcare system, it's mandated that they receive acculturation and linguistic training. Some studies showed that we were reviewing that a lot of the individuals coming out of medical school or nursing school feel unprepared to go out into the workforce and work with individuals with an LEP. Then you fast forward a couple years to 2003, and the Office of Civil Rights, again, and ways to improve access, also created guidelines to notify LEP individuals of services available, including interpretation and translation. At this point, it's been mandated that they be given these services at no cost, and it has to be clearly posted in all healthcare offices that are receiving federal funding, which is pretty much everyone. But whether or not it's happening, I'll get to that soon. And then in 2011, more standards were created that required the documentation of preferred languages for all patients and ensure competence. So this is the paper that you receive when you go to the clinic and you ask for an interpreter, and then they give you a paper that tells you, do you speak another language at home, and which do you prefer? And if they say that your secondary language is preferred, then they're required for you to obtain an interpreter. It is mandated. So then finally, you fast forward to 2016, and the Department of Health Services adopted Section 1557 of the ACA, the Federal Affordable Care Act, specifically addressing discrimination and in health programs and activities. So kind of like really establishing and zeroing in on all the provisions that have been created since 1964 and really establishing. And then another thing that the Section 1557 gave was that health individuals have to offer qualified versus competent interpreters. This means that individuals would have to be certified or licensed or really qualified within the state that they're working to be able to interpret, and not just competent. Another thing that this prohibited was the use of minors as interpreters, and I'll talk about effectiveness and access here in the next slide. But I remember growing up as a child, being 8 or 9 and living in rural Wyoming, having to go with my parents to interpret. And I mean, how much does a 9-year-old know, right? Especially about medical conditions. So this created barriers. And it wasn't that my parents weren't trying to learn English, but sometimes, I mean, we were newly arrived immigrants, and access to an interpreter in rural Wyoming is not that good. And it's not that they weren't trying to learn. I mean, they were already speaking the language, but not at a level where maybe that I was to be able to communicate well with health providers. So what are some forms of language assistance, and how are they effective or not effective? So you want to go to that next one? So Spanish interpreters or qualified interpreters is perceived to be the best type of form of language, but really does it help? Are they around? And then we also have telephone-assisted interpreters. We have electronic generated translated information, which is one of those devices that you can use to interpret. We have written material, family members, gestures, whether they're hand or facial gestures, and of course the other categorization, which could be a lot of different ways. But as you can see from the graph, the most perceived effective modes of interpreting is with the qualified individual. But how many people really are qualified, even in the state of Wyoming, to be able to interpret, and what languages, right? When there's so many languages, and growing up in Wyoming, or in the United States, it is a multilingual society. And as you can see from the graph, the most effective would be family members. You can see that the perceived and the actual effectiveness kind of meet in a certain spot where you can say, and a family member. And then you get into scheduled visits versus crisis. If individuals visit a hospital or a doctor with a scheduled appointment, then that gives them the ability to obtain an interpreter ahead of time or arrange a phone call for somebody to interpret or translate during the visit. But what happens in a crisis? When individuals end up in the ER and in rural Wyoming, what do we do then, right? There's not translators just floating around. So what's the best mode of communication? That would be a family member. And how effective is that? As we can see, it kind of equals out. But then you get into the culturalization, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we see this in mental health too. One of our studies that we were researching was saying that 55% of individuals don't return to a second session in counseling because of the language barrier, and they don't feel like they're being understood. And it's not just culture, it's the actual language. Stuff gets misinterpreted, and individuals just don't feel, and it's prohibiting a trusting relationship that, I mean, in counseling is one of our primary goals. So then, we're going to go talk about surviving the healthcare system and how this is important, and cultural assimilation and acculturation, and access and quality to this. In order to survive the U.S. healthcare system and receive quality services, the expectation is that you assimilate. And what does this mean? Well, I'm a perfect example, right? Going through the healthcare system myself, and I'll talk about a little bit of testimony after this. You are forced to assimilate to obtain the best healthcare system that you can get. As immigrants, they lose such a culture-related protective factors, such as behaviors and social networks, and their health deteriorates. So you begin to lose some of your things that you bring from your native country. And what are some alternatives to healthcare when individuals can't access? And these are not, I'm not saying that these are bad. It's just that you're not getting you're not seeking all your options. And some, for example, in the Mexican community, curanderas, or naturopathic holistic healers, is always an option. But are you exploring other options in the healthcare? And most of the time, the answer is no. One, because you don't trust the individuals. Two, there's a language barrier, and they might not understand where you're coming from. Or, for example, in mental health, panic attacks, el susto, or ataque de nervios, a nervous attack is what they call it. And when in reality, you got to go seek health care. I mean, then you get into the culturalization and simulation, and where do you meet with that? And then, oh, no, the next one is just a question. So we have some time, a little bit. That concludes the research part of it. And then on our abstract, we did talk about a little bit of testimony. So I'll go ahead and share a little bit of what I experienced in the healthcare system back in 2012. As many of the individuals here around the University of Wyoming know, that I was brought to the United States at a very young age, which I came in as an undocumented status. And throughout my life, I've had to obtain higher education through private funding or competitive scholarships, and working and waiting tables. And one year I decided that I was going to start working in the oil field, because that's the only way I was going to get the big bucks to be able to, as I moved from junior college, grab my first associate's, then my second, then I realized that in order to obtain a bachelor's or even a postgraduate degree, I would need the finances to do so. The only way I was going to do that was by working in the energy industry here in the state of Wyoming, which, as many know, could provide a really good job opportunity and income. And working as going to night school at junior college, I was working in the oil field when in February of 2012, I got hurt really, really bad. I almost lost my leg. I was out in the field. We were working on battery houses. And immediately the foreman and everyone started running around. And my leg, I had torn my ACL, cut my quad tendon, my quad muscle. Immediately the supervisor started calling the hospital, 911. And they started to arrange air transportation. And in my head, I'm thinking, no way, there's no way I'm going to be able to pay for this. I'm undocumented. I don't have any insurance. How am I going to get to the hospital? And sure enough, I had to speak on the phone and said that I declined air transportation because I feared that I would have to end up paying all these medical bills because of my status. Fortunately, I made it to the hospital on a long vehicle ride. And while I was in the hospital, I had to wait almost 2.5 hours to see a doctor. And of course, this is the whole time I'm bleeding. My knee is hurt. I mean, it was one of the worst experiences ever. And it wasn't until a nurse came in and recognized me from the high school swim team. I swam with the son, and it wasn't even a few minutes later when a doctor came in and decided that I needed attention. So I've experienced a little bit of discrimination, and this is why I've been passionate about this. And how does it evolve with social justice? And I think testimony is a good way to show why the system is broken, and even something as simple as a language barrier can affect that. And the way, like Erica was saying, the way that doctors perceive you. Coming into the hospital, they knew that I was going to be undocumented. I was working in the oil field. I knew that that's the only way I was going to be able to pay for college. So, I mean, I had to do it, right? And, I mean, it was a difficult healthcare process to navigate, and I can go on, but just because of time, we'd like to open it up for questions. But that's just one example of the many questions that we have, even here in Wyoming, which is something that people say, that doesn't happen around here. No, it happens. And I think telling testimony, sometimes it's good just to kind of say and put a face to the problem. Does anybody have any questions? We have some time. Yes. Oh, I can continue with my story. So I ended up being bedridden for about 3 months. And at this point, Department of Health Services had contacted me at Workman's Comp. And at that point, I was criminalized. I was commissioned to appear in court or submit my paperwork of what was going to happen next, and there's a lot of details. And at this point, I was granted an attorney, just because I knew that because of my status, I would have to somehow end up in the court system and defend my case, right? I had previous knowledge that it doesn't matter, and according to all the federal laws that we currently have, the hospital is to care for me. And I noticed too that the Department of Workmen's Comp, Department of Health here in the state of Wyoming, at first said they weren't going to pay for anything. And at this point, I was not searching for compensation. I mean, just the medical bills and everything I was doing therapy for about 8 months, so the bills were up there, and I had to learn how to walk again. My sister's here; she can testify to that. But it was very difficult, and it got to a point where we were heading to the higher courts, and one day I received a phone call that they were just going to drop the case and they were going to be paying for my medical bills. And again, why is this important? Why, sometimes people say, well, why do we have to pay for their health care? Why do we have to pay? I mean, it happened on the job, and it's the law. You can't say no to health care. I mean, I think it's a human right, and everyone deserves health care, regardless of, like Title VI says, race, nationality, status, and everything else. So, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm a DACA recipient.
And in terms of your status, in terms of going to university, four-year university, how do you think that also, your status also impacted that in terms of your moving up to the next level?
Oh, yeah. So I've had to navigate a very difficult career path as in terms of academics. I've been in school on and off for about 10 years now, from the junior college to in California, and trying to seek the best possibility of obtaining the best education that I could. And because of my status, financial help has not always been there. Undocumented students or DACA recipients in the state of Wyoming do not receive the Hathaway. Luckily, we are considered to be in-state residents as we graduated from a high school here in the state of Wyoming. But there is no federal grants, there is no federal funding, FAFSA, we don't obtain any of that. So, but you know, like my grandma says, querer es poder. When there's a will, there's a way. So if that meant working in the oil field, getting hurt really bad, waitressing, I DJ'd during junior year of college, junior college years, and just going out and giving my testimony, you know, talking about these dialogues at a setting like this and making people aware that the University of Wyoming does have DACA recipients and that we do need help with finances. Thank God for like Multicultural Affairs, they offer scholarships for individuals, and now they're offering a scholarship for DACA students. Latino Studies is doing the same thing. Slowly but surely, there's progress. Is there more that could be done? I think yes. And I see the possibility of that in the near future if we continue to work with the administration and with other professors who are very knowledgeable in these situations. And I mean, DACA students do obtain a work permit, and they do obtain a promise of no deportation for 2 years. And due to our current political climate, even that's being questioned, right? So yes, it's been a difficult journey, and my story is one of thousands and probably one of 50 here in the state of Wyoming. And I do see people who are collaborating, and I do see student support and faculty support, and hopefully in the future we see that from administrators here at the university. So thank you, great question. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. Any other questions? No? Oh, yes, Amanda.
I'm curious to know, as a healthcare provider, then, what are some things that I can do to help my clients feel more comfortable in my provider space?
Yeah, we'll both answer that, but I think understanding where they're coming from and understanding and not labeling them, specifically the first generation immigrants or first generation, because usually these are the individuals who have the language barriers, newly or established immigrants, and the 1.5 generation, which are children of immigrant parents. Not labeling them and understanding the process of, in some cases, the assimilation and acculturation they're going through. It's not an easy thing, and I say that by experience. Learning the language was not easy, and then to go to places and be judged by that, or even expressing your language in public and saying, go back to your country, and this is America. I mean, that's hard in of itself, and just being understanding of individuals coming to your practice, and doing some personal research. That's always considerate, taking the time to research, and even like Liz was talking about in her presentation, if you have a private practice, where is that private practice going to be, and who's going to be your target population, and if so, if you end up in a place maybe with a lot of immigrants or non-native English speakers, then what are you going to do to prepare that community to be able to receive your services? And of course, oh, and I forgot to mention, 13% of the hospitals surveyed only held up to the 4 standards that all the policies. Only 13%. So you can only imagine that 13% of the individuals or of the hospitals are actually implementing all this with their clients. And that's a very low number. So even having materials in Spanish and English makes a tremendous difference. So I'm not saying go learn a new language, because everybody knows that that's hard, right? But just understanding where they're coming from and being patient, I think, helps a lot.
Yeah, and I second the doing some research. I think self-education is a huge piece of that in linguistic competence and cultural competence. Just continually seeking information. The internet is a wonderful place. And yeah, I think analyzing in that self-research and education, looking for information about privilege and kind of self-reflection about what that means on the part of the provider's identity and how that might influence any client that they would have in their office or in the healthcare setting. And then also just being educated about, the Title VI and language assistance, and being willing to utilize those resources, because they do make a huge difference in the quality of healthcare services for clients and individuals seeking those services.
Yes, sir. I can speak from that got loud real quick. From a cultural acculturation and assimilation. Going to, as an immigrant, and if we're more specific, as an undocumented immigrant or undocumented individual who comes to the U.S., I mean, it's already very fearful to go seek health care, because you don't want to, just like it is reporting crime, you don't want to, a lot of times you're a victim of crime because you don't want to report it. You don't want to jeopardize your current stay here in the United States. And with the current administration, there's been a lot of fear that's been instilled in all of us. And I say us, even though I have DACA, just because I still identify with that community. So with the current administration, and I've talked to individuals who are refraining from going to a doctor and are sticking to the holistic curanderas. And just because they don't want to be othered, one, and two, they don't want to be put into jeopardy of deportation. And even individuals who are pregnant are scared to go to the hospital. And at this point, we're talking about language barriers, but we're also talking about the current administration and the way that they've instilled some of this fear on individuals. So you can just see the problems with the healthcare system that we're in.
I do think that potentially some more, I'm looking for words, regulation on insurance companies and discrimination on the part of insurance companies could be a benefit that arises from that federalized kind of insurance stuff, for lack of a better term, in implementing, Title VI anti-discrimination laws on the part of insurance companies rather than the privatized companies. I think there's a little bit more room for discrimination when it's much more privatized than when we have more federal regulations nationwide.
Yeah, and if you see the provision from the ACA, the 1557, I mean, if you get rid of ACA right away, you're getting rid of the policy that prohibits discrimination based on race, ethnicity, country of origin. So you can already see the problematic systemic problems that would approach.
And it is interesting because currently, under Title VI, it is unlawful to discriminate against an individual based on nationality, race. There's a whole list of things, but it doesn't actually include language in this way yet. So technically, someone could still be discriminated against based on the way they speak English or their lack of proficiency in that language. So that, at this point in time, is not actually protected under this act. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.